Thanks so much, Jenny, for sorting everyone out, and thanks so much, Helen, for the invitation. It's and everyone else who organized the event. It's really a pleasure to be here. Um, that's the actual title. My title is called "Odd Little, Just Barely Coherent Splinters versus Less Odd but Somewhat More Coherent, Many Flavored Fieldlets." And it won't make sense now. It might still not make sense by the end, but it'll make a little bit more sense, I hope. This is actually the sequel. I'm going to present the sequel, or the start of a sequel that I'm working on, this paper that just came out, Build Word Gyms, Not Word Factories. So I need to quickly summarize that and kind of so I can pick up where I left off. So 2 points. First, when I think about AI, specifically LLMs, I think it's really important that we keep in mind the concept of proletarianization. This is a concept from Bernard Stiegler, as well as from Marx. Stiegler kind of evolves it from Marx. For Marx, proletarianization describes the de-skilling of the worker once they move into an industrial mode of labor. So imagine you're kind of an artisan who knows how to make a bowl, and you have this kind of holistic, complete, complex knowledge of how to make this bowl. Then you or your progeny move into the Manchester factory, and suddenly you're operating some part of a system that makes a bowl, but you no longer yourself know how to make the bowl. That knowledge has been kind of abstracted into the factory system and into the capital that owns the system. So Stiegler generalizes this term, proletarianization, to describe the general threat that faces us whenever we use any kind of technology. So the invention of recorded music, for instance, has allowed many of us to forget, to remember, to learn how to play music. And here, ChatGPT is obviously really dangerous as a potential cause of proletarianization when our students are using ChatGPT to generate the paper for them. They are not learning how to write a paper. So Stiegler's point is not that we should avoid technology, but that we should use it and craft thinking tools carefully so that they do not become tools of stupidity. We need to make sure that if we give something up, we get something in return, some new skill, some new mode of thinking. Like we do with writing, by the way. Stiegler is kind of conscious of the Platonic critique of writing. It makes us forget things. Yeah, maybe, but we come out ahead in the bargain most of the time, we hope. So in this recent paper, I advocated that we should build word gyms, not word factories. Rather than using AI to make writing easier, we should actually make it harder. We should make it more painful, more difficult, and to present us as writers with interesting challenges. And the claim that I'm going to further develop today is that LLMs, large language models, are not the only game in town. If they are really, really impressive, smaller systems, like many of those that we saw from Nick earlier, and I'll show one of my own, have their own potential as kind of writing assistants that LLMs don't have. And maybe to phrase it a little bit more neutrally, they both might have their own affordances. So first, I'm going to show you a word gym of my own called Illusion Injector. And it does what it says on the tin. It injects illusions, or helps you inject illusions to very old things from Wikipedia as you are writing. As I was developing this, or before I was listening to Milton as I was doing the dishes and just marveling at how rapid fire the illusions are in Paradise Lost, for instance. How my mind cannot do that. My mind cannot do that on its own. How could I create a system that would get me halfway there, but then present me with the challenge of actually using the illusion? So this is not an AI system. This is not an LLM system. The illusions were extracted from all of English language Wikipedia using what's called a dependency parser. So for instance, here, the keyword is the word argument, and then the kind of little, what did I call it? The odd little shard or odd little splinter of text that's extracted is of the Lutheran Johann Marbach of Strasbourg. That's the kind of what's extracted and then connected to this word argument. So my code went through all of Wikipedia, and for words like argument and a bunch of other words too, it found and collected this dictionary of different things that might be alluded to. So this is a rather crude-looking interface that I've developed for Illusion Injector. So as you're typing up above, as you type, the system is paying attention to what you type, and if you type a word like, what was it, argument, it will populate the fields at the bottom with up to five illusions that you might inject into your writing. And you can, there's these special weird key combinations that you can use to load them and then inject them at the cursor position. So the text in all caps there is, that's an injected illusion. So I think the point is that this system, compared to an LLM, is clearly not very smart. If you use the word sword, Illusion Injector assumes that all sentences having to do with swords from English language Wikipedia are equally as relevant to whatever it is you're writing about. Maybe we could call this just barely cohesion, just a smidge of cohesion, to distinguish it from the really full-fledged, or at least much more complex ways that LLMs can produce cohesion, or maybe following Nick's argument, maybe it's the illusion of cohesion or something like that. So yeah, the LLM is really good at kind of trying to kind of weave in some text into some other text. Here, they're kind of just sort of jammed together, and it's left up to the writer, me. I think I'm the only person who's ever used this system to make sense of the illusion. And yeah, so I think of this as a gym that makes me work harder as the writer. Well, it makes one thing easier. It finds illusions for me. But then once it does that, I have to do some work to pick one, and then to try to make it make sense in a poem, to try to keep the poem from starting to become really, really bad because it has this sort of odd thing that doesn't quite belong. So there's a labor that I have to perform to kind of recuperate it or integrate it somehow. And sometimes that involves actually thinking about the history, pausing, reading at least the Wikipedia article from which the kind of splinter comes from, maybe reading other sources and trying to learn about, I don't know, a 14th century Ruthenian prince or something like that. Yeah, so it offers me a new challenge. It's one way of making writing harder. So here's a snippet from one poem written with Illusion Injector. Yeah, I present this as kind of textual data, and it's up for you to decide whether I've gotten kind of smarter or the opposite through my interactions with the system. And I really mean that kind of in an unironic way. I hope that I'm being deproletarianized through my interactions with this system. And there's a book of these poems and poems written with other non-LLM word gems forthcoming, I think in the spring, from Disperse Holdings Press in New York City. Here we are. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears to an LLM, still a word gem. This is from a book that came out earlier this year, Salon de Fantôme, or it has a secret title, or Streptohormetic Prompt Engineering for the Production of a Jagged Noetic Substrate. So in this book, which I wrote over the course of 5 days, I participated in a philosophical salon of sorts with over 200 AI fabricated characters. I won't go into the details of how I fabricated them and tried to make the model a little bit more interesting than it was to start out. Instead, I want to think about the affordances of thinking with LLM generated text. So this section that you're seeing here, this is not, yeah, actually it is computer generated writing of a sort. It's from a simple, Python script that chooses two pieces of artwork from a list that I hand compiled and creates this challenge. And it's a challenge that's for me. So I'm kind of in this, you have to imagine yourself as this like kind of dramatic conceit. I am the judge. I am the judge of this artistic contest where over and over again, two pieces of art from this list are juxtaposed, and I have to cast judgment. I have to decide which one is the better artwork. So this in itself is a sort of a gym, I suppose, randomly choosing two things from a list and asking you to compare them. You may be forced to notice things about them that you wouldn't otherwise. But actually, this gym was a little more complicated. Before I was able or allowed to give my summary judgment, do I like Jarman's Blue or Ed Ruscha's painting better? I would first have to listen to the pronouncements of 5 different AI characters, again, randomly selected from my list of 20. And they would be asked to first give their opinion that I would have to listen to. So here's an example of one. So this is a young, sensitive, kind of shut-in man who's really into video games. He was given I should say the model at this point was randomly given the word N64, like Nintendo 64, which you may see at the bottom, so that the model would have to use the word N64 to think about, you could say, or respond about Ed Ruscha versus Derek Jarman. But first, let's note even the most obvious differences in the textual features between this example and Illusion Injector. First, it's much more coherent and cohesive. That's what LMs do or give the illusion of doing. Second, and this is not unrelated to the first, their responses are much longer. Notice that Illusion Injector, computer generated, but really just fetched or splintered off little short bits of text. Generally speaking, when you are generating texts, and we saw some examples from Nick that are pointing in the, or kind of exceptions to this, but I think in general it's fair to say that if you're computer generating text with simplistic techniques, it's kind of hard to make 2 words make sense together. It's really hard to make a whole sentence that makes sense and has kind of a traditional sort of coherence. And the larger your sort of textual scale gets, paragraph, multiple paragraphs, an entire text, those, what the linguists call those long distance dependencies, become much more difficult to manage. So one of the simple, easy to underappreciate ways that LLMs are different than most, not all, simple text generation systems is that they can just rattle off on, kind of as much as they want or as much as you want them to, while maintaining the thread insofar as they can maintain the thread to begin with. That's why I use the term fieldlets. I think of them as, a field is something that maybe doesn't quite have a border. You can kind of, find a little bit more field from the LLM if you want some more field. So if Illusion Injector is a system for generating weird little shards or splinters, this system, which is also called Salon de Fantôme, generated somewhat less weird surfaces or substrates or fields or fieldlets at a somewhat larger scale. And I do think there's a different sort of challenge here. I'd have to read through, when I was in the position of being the kind of judge of this salon, I would have to read all of the, the text from this character and from 5 more, and it would take some time. And some of it was really boring and a slog. And I would have to try to find, is there one interesting thing that this character says? So it's a different kind of cognitive labor in reading and thinking about and thinking with this sort of text than in the previous example. A different sort of making writing harder, you might say. Another affordance of LLMs is that, as we know, they do impressions, and more generally, they take instructions. So when working with smaller systems, adding linguistic diversity can be tricky and expensive. If I had wanted to have different sorts of illusions in Illusion Injector, I could have gone out and tried to collect another corpus that it could have gathered from, but that would have been a lot of work. With LLMs, adding linguistic diversity is comparatively cheap. I simply had some Python code that would do things like say, okay, now respond in the style of Mao, but he really likes jazz, and make sure to use the word sandwich. And I could really cheaply generate these different voices. And none of it was very, to be clear, I'm not saying that the output from the LLM was particularly good. That's not, for my purposes, that important, actually. I'm just trying to create a surface to think against. And so the ability of an LLM to create something like a really cheap, not always that satisfying heteroglossia, that was something that I could use, I think. So the challenge of writing here, the way in which Salon de Fantôme made writing harder for me was that I would have to sort through these rather different voices, which did sometimes bring up ideas that were different than mine and different from each other's, and try to weigh them and to produce some kind of synthesis. This is from another character who's a monosyllabic monarchist mountain and a misanthrope too. Were either of these systems, the rather simplistic allusion injector, the more computationally complicated Salon de Fantôme, better than the other? Well, if you're looking at the fluency of the computer-generated text, I guess you'd have to say that the LLM's computer-generated text is more impressive. But okay, and here I'm getting kind of political in a sense. When you focus on proletarianization, when that's what you really care about, this doesn't really matter whether the text is good or not. All we should be worried about is whether some human mind is left proletarianized, or if this mind has gotten, as Stiegler would say, a return from some interaction with human-generated text. And this is always an empirical question, and a really thorny one to answer, I think. My own feeling is that now is the time to be ruthlessly pragmatic and empirical. Can we use LLMs to make writing harder in interesting ways? Sure. What about less complicated statistical algorithms? Sure, maybe. Purely aleatoric ones, really simple ones? Sure, maybe. Oh, I forgot to show you. This is me responding to, this is my judgment on the question of Ed Ruscha versus Derek Jarman. Open source, sure, maybe, depends on the model. Closed source, perhaps not ideal, but sure, maybe. In other words, to really focus on the problem of proletarianization and how to avoid it might involve relaxing attention towards, on the one hand, the quality of computer-generated text. Can ChatGPT write interesting literature, as well as the politics involved in the production of language models in other systems? Is ChatGPT inherently evil because OpenAI is evil, or because of the closed and ethically dubious way its training data was gathered? Or at least the questions of whether a system generates beautiful / interesting text, whether the system was created in a politically blameless way, and whether the system can be used in ways that assist minds to resist proletarianization are three different questions. Maybe at times they are orthogonal questions. This is not to downplay any of these questions, just to point out that they are indeed different. And I think I have a couple minutes left, with that, I will switch gears and just introduce Ensemble Park. So this is edited by Katy Gero and by myself. This is a literary magazine devoted to computer-mediated writing, let's say, or human plus computer writing. And we're particularly interested in finding new and interesting models of the ways that humans and computers can interact in loops. Yeah, I've just kind of given you my theoretical stance on how we should think about interactions between human writers and computer-generated text. Certainly not the only one guiding this publication. But I will say that we have included not just text, but pretty extensive process statements that describe how the writers interacted with particular computational mechanisms, particular systems. And the hope is that these descriptions themselves will be useful for others as they figure out how to integrate computational media into their lives as writers. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you so much. Oh, and there are copies, so just ask us for a copy. We have a few copies, so just ask us for a copy.
Okay, I don't have any slides, so you have to look at me. I guess you could close your eyes. I once went to a reading. Actually, Nick was presenting the reading with Tom Comita, his book, Nature book, and he read from his book, and he asked everyone to close their eyes during the reading, which I thought. So you're welcome to close your eyes, and I promise not to think that you're asleep. But you're also welcome to fall asleep if you're tired. I think that's fine. All right. So my name is Katy. I'm a postdoc in computer science at Harvard. Actually, just recently accepted a faculty position at the University of Sydney in Australia. Thank you. I grew up in Sydney, so I'm kind of going home to spend time with my family. And my research in computer science is in a subdiscipline that's called human-computer interaction, often referred to as HCI. And it's a bit of a funky field. Most of the people in HCI are in computer science, but people are also sometimes coming at it from psychology departments, business schools, social science, as well as information schools. So it has this like real hodgepodge of methods and like disciplinary approaches, but it does kind of harken back in its conception to computer science departments. And so most of us are in computer science departments. I'm also a writer, and obviously like very interested in computational writing and computational poetry. And so I'll talk a little bit more about my writing kind of towards the end of this talk. But I wanted to say a little bit about like why I did this with Kyle and like why we were interested in this. And coming at it from like spending a lot of my time with computer scientists, which is what happens when you're a computer science um, PhD and postdoc, is so much of computer science, right, is about this idea of like optimization and correctness. So there's a sense, and you can kind of see this in the AI movements of today, but I think it really has been there throughout the history of computer science, this idea that if we develop the right kind of mathematical construct, we can take a problem and we can solve that problem or kind of shift the problem to its most optimal state. And you might think that this is just happening in the world of like neural networks or algorithms, but I actually think it's happening in the design of computer interfaces as well. So we can think about kind of the early successes of human-computer interaction might be the invention of the desktop, right? So prior to this metaphor of the desktop and things where you could kind of drag and drop things around, most things that you did on computers was through the terminal, right? So you're like writing not natural language, but some kind of written language to interact with the computer. And then they had this great idea about why don't we allow something called direct manipulation, where we can actually kind of drag and drop things on the screen. And this really opened up computers to be much more accessible to a wider range of people. And we've kind of seen that this desktop metaphor and the direct manipulation that it allows has really lasted for many, many decades, right? We're still using it today. It hasn't really been displaced by anything else yet. But even in this idea of direct manipulation, when you go back to the HCI research that was proposing it and proposing how to study and understand it, there was this sense of really trying to optimize what a user might be trying to do with a computer. So there's this idea of the 7-stage model from Donald Norman, and he said, okay, like the user comes, you have something that you're trying to do with a computer, you make a plan about how to do it, you try to enact it with the computer, and then you want some kind of feedback to be able to see whether or not this thing was done successfully, right? So you might say, I want to move this Word document to the trash. You go, you kind of drag the document into the trash icon, and then maybe there's a little like bing or a little like poof that comes out of the trash icon that lets you evaluate whether or not that action was successful. And this whole framing, right, is about trying to understand, like, have we optimized the user experience? Have we let people do things in the most optimal way possible? And can we somehow prove, perhaps using the methodologies of psychology or sociology, can we somehow prove that we have made it more optimal by doing human subjects research? And so, okay, this is like a large framing that maybe you've heard of that certainly exists in worlds outside of computer science, but definitely exists within the world of computer science. And when I came to computer science in 2017, and I was really interested in language and writing and poetry, I was seeing this kind of thinking being applied to the idea of how we might use computers to support writing, and in particular writing. And so you see this framing of, well, people are out there, we suppose, trying to write stories, and writing stories is really hard, so how can we make it easier? And so this is where you start to get this research of suggesting the next line in a story or something like that, which like eventually turned into these email clients, right, that try to pick up the end of your sentence while you're writing some email about where would you like to meet? Would you like to meet on Thursday at Bryant Park? And so as I was looking at this research and kind of being in a way like inoculated into this world of research, I was just like, it just doesn't seem like that's what writing is about, right? And you can, most of the people here are artists or very interested in art, and art is most certainly not about the optimization of the experience or somehow like making it easier or trying to prove that someone was able to do something more easily with a certain interface. And so like even in like 2018, 2019, we were seeing this like AI research about generating poetry that was about like hitting a button and getting your poem. And it was really framed as, well, writing poems is really hard and a lot of people feel like they can't do it. What if we could give them a tool that could do it for them? This was like being published in computer science venues, AI venues, um, and it just seemed to like entirely uh, miss the point, maybe, of what writing is about. And so another collaboration that Kyle and I did kind of early on in my PhD is we actually like got a group of poets together and said, hey, if you could design any kind of computational system to help you with poetry or to somehow use in your writing practice, what would you design? And we had people make these little design briefs. We called them poetry machines. And we published this in a computer science venue to say, look, when you ask people who are engaged in art practice how they might use computation, the things that come out are very weird and are very much not in line with this idea of optimizing the process, right? Some people wanted like a weird seance ghost bot that would kind of talk to them in the morning about their coffee, and other people had this kind of long laundry list of, well, I wanted to give me similes and metaphors and pull tweets and do all this other fun stuff. And we kind of compared this to the literature in computer science, which was very narrow in its conception of how computers might be involved in the writing process. And so I think part of my goal with Ensemble Park is to showcase these like different ways that people are really out there in the world using technology. And like some of this is language models and some of it isn't, but I think our attempt is to show some of the breadth and the ways that people are envisioning that this being part of their practice. And I think my like computer science HCI influence on this work is, to Kyle's point, we have people write these extensive process statements that say something about how they produce this work, and we have these interviews where we ask them about it. And so what I think maybe is nice and that we might want to like crib from the HCI community is this idea that we do human subjects research. We want to put it in the hands of people and record something about how they interact with it. But maybe our goals of this recording and the kind of proofs we're trying to put out in the world are a little bit different. Okay, so that's my interest in this. That's kind of where I come from. I'm going to talk a little bit about a research project I have that really relates to the talk we heard earlier about the stock photography. And then I'm going to close on a book of my own computational poetry that should be coming out in the spring. So this talk's a little schizophrenic, but stay with me. You'll be able to like see the themes throughout. So a lot of the work in this is using large language models, and obviously large language models are the kind of exciting thing of the moment. And actually, it's really hard to be in computer science right now and like not work on generative models. There's not a lot of funding. You kind of see it happening in industry where people who used to be researchers at Microsoft doing like really great accessibility research are now told to like drop what they're doing and make sure that everything they do includes language models. And all the researchers are like, but I don't study that. Like, but that's where everything's going. And something that I started to get really interested in was the training data that these are used on. And kind of in 2020, 2021, even 2022, there was a lot more information about what these were trained on. And then as it got more and more corporate, like your access to this kind of information really decreases. But one thing that is certainly true is that, at least in the early days, there was a very popular corpus called Books 3, which is kind of a really mundane name. It just kind of vaguely suggests that it's the third corpus of books, which means absolutely nothing. But if you dig into what Books 3 really is, uh, it's a downloaded corpus of pirated books. So it's mostly contemporary novels and memoirs with living authors whose books had been like uploaded to a pirating website and were now downloaded and were put into this larger collection called the Pile, which is an open source data set for training language models. So it's similar to Lion in that anyone can go download it. And it has this kind of innocuous thing in it called Books 3, which if you kind of dig into the research papers, you can like finally find a citation for Books 3. And if you follow that citation, and I kid you not, it goes to a Twitter post of like a guy being like, hey, I downloaded this corpus of books, anyone can use it. This is in like real research, real research. Okay, so I got really interested in how the people in books 3 feel about this. Obviously, a lot of them are very mad, and we kind of were seeing this in the news, and we've seen this in a large number of lawsuits, mainly looking at copyright law, and I think we're going to be talking about that tomorrow a bit. But I felt like there was this space to have a kind of academic perspective, and instead of ask like, are writers upset, are writers not upset, try to understand how are writers reasoning about their use of their work in this way. And so I want to make sure that I don't run over time. And so what was notable about this study, and we took a kind of sociology perspective where we interviewed a bunch of writers when we did a grounded theory analysis, was that the writers we spoke to typically weren't against the technology itself. Many kind of didn't see a particular benefit of this technology, but they didn't think the technology, the idea of language models, the idea of using text to like train something that could generate text is not necessarily bad, nor were writers like against unexpected use cases of their writing, right? So as an artist, you have this understanding that when you publish something, when you put something out into the world, you're participating in this larger cultural project, and people are going to use your work in unexpected ways. Like everyone talks about, I learned to write by reading other writers, and I've become a writer in a way that those writers may not have understood or appreciated. So people aren't necessarily upset about the technology, and they're not necessarily upset about unexpected use cases of their writing. But rather, what's particularly upsetting seems to be, on one hand, this power differential between themselves as a writer who's struggling to make a living and these tech corporations, which seem to be making money hand over fist, and kind of generally upset about this concept of like a technological oligarchy where there's this large number of centralized people um, who are kind of extracting resources from people who haven't given their consent. And in addition to being upset about these large power differentials, there was this idea of like a lack of belief or understanding about the projects of large language models at all. What are large language models for? What are they trying to do? If I was kind of presented with something in terms of what this project is about, I may be able to like understand whether or not I'd want to participate in it. But obviously, with the scale of large language models, it's also hard to understand how any one person would really make a difference. Like even if you had the ability to opt out, right? It does seem like there's this big thing going on that any individual has very little control over. And so something I've been thinking about is how can we kind of wrest power back into the hands of people? And I think a lot of writers are interested in this technology, but are maybe not interested in participating in the kind of corporate version of this technology. And so I've become really interested in this idea of community language models or community generative models generally, where people kind of come together and pool their data in order to make these pre-trained models that then can be used in the ways that they would like and they can feel good about because they've kind of been created for the community by the community. And maybe we could have these ideas of like vegan models, where like models that are adhering to perhaps the strictest moral standards in terms of how we collect this data, and what kind of things would we be creating if we were actually had these kinds of models accessible to people. Um, and I think kind of like Ensemble Park, part of this investigation of training data and thinking about how we might make community models is about challenging prevailing ideas in the computer science world about what writers might be interested in. Kind of like to Kyle's point, are writers most interested, or any writers interested in like extremely fluent, coherent text that like perfectly mimics their style, versus maybe interested in these other things like the ways in which models were created, or the more like glitchy aesthetics that they might be interested in that come from not perfectly coherent text. So, okay, so I started with Ensemble Park. I just talked about some work about training data. I'm going to very briefly touch on my own work, and then we'll open the floor. So I have a book coming out in the spring called The Anxiety of Conception. And so in my own writing, I've really been interested in how computation can kind of change the way in which my work is read. So I'm actually, as a writer, not particularly interested in computer-generated text, partially because I really like writing. And so it's not clear to me that I should want to like give up some part of that to the machine. And I don't think this actually has anything to do with optimization or not optimization. I just think I enjoy writing, like that's why I do it. And so I'd like to keep doing it myself. But I am interested in how computation might shift the way in which my writing is read. So I recently had a baby in March. He's very cute. And I wrote a series of 100 prose poems in the year before he was born, so while I was trying to conceive and while I was pregnant, and then 100 prose poems in the first year after he was born. And obviously, these poems were written in a particular order, and their temporal order is very meaningful. And this very particular break point, which is giving birth, is a very meaningful point to me. My birth was very traumatic, as many births are. My pregnancy was complicated in very particular ways. I had bleeding in the first trimester. So the kind of temporal story that these poems impart is a very meaningful one. But I have this sense that over time, the particular temporal order will become a little bit less important. And perhaps this like loosening of the memories will like let me incorporate this moment in my life in a different way that I might not be able to see right now. And so what I did is I created an algorithm that would kind of score how well two poems went together, based purely on the words within them. So poems that used similar words in similar places would be more likely to put together. And then the idea is that we can turn this into a question about how to order the poems, such that poems that are more similar to each other from a prosody perspective can be paired together. And so this is totally ignoring any temporal elements. And this is going to be published by a press called Nothing to Say. And the conceit of this press is that there's some kind of computational element such that every printing of the book is different somehow. So every printing is unique. And so the first few books, the temporal order will be somewhat preserved. And then over time, there will be this mixing of the poems such that the poems slowly shift towards this ordering that has much more to do with the words and the prosody as opposed to the order in which they were written. This also kind of, as people purchase the book, it kind of reflects not just the way in which over time the temporal order becomes less important, but it's actually because every printing of the book takes this step towards a different order, it's actually an engagement with readership. So it's about as the book becomes more read, the order turns into something else. And I think this is also reflecting the way in which when you put something out into the world, right, the readers are bringing their own conceit to it, and the interpretation and the way in which your work is received changes over time with the readers themselves. And so the idea here is that as more people read the book, and we don't know how many people that will be, but the idea is that theoretically there could be an infinite number of printings. The book will get infinitely different into the future in terms of the order in which they're written. So I think I'm gonna leave it there. Hopefully I was able to provide some context about why I think Ensemble Park is really exciting, both from a literary perspective as well as from a computer science perspective, and thinking about how we might be able to kind of draw on this richer history of computer science and all these things that both include the work towards language models and how we might make them more accessible to people, but also think about how computer science can be involved in ways that aren't just about writing things for us. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.
Start off with, you don't want questions, and then we kind of get the ball rolling on the audience as well. Lots of great stuff to think about. My sheets are covered with scribbles and notes, but I want to maybe ask all of you a question, and then you can respond. I won't do it individually, but I will ask you individual questions. So Daniel, I was really interested in this idea of a machine that produces a kind of visual aesthetic, and couldn't help but thinking back to conceptual art in the lunch we were discussing. Someone like Solomon, who said the idea becomes a machine that makes art, right? And he produces, as many of you know, Solomon's work, gives instructions, and then people produce the work itself. But this is in the 1960s, long before LLMs and the different paper. So there's a notion of de-skilling involved. You're not trying to show off how well you can paint. You're giving someone else the opportunity to use their hand to produce something. But there's also an irony. And I thought in a lot of the work you showed, there wasn't a real sense of irony. And I'm wondering, what is the role of irony, and is it possible for artificial intelligence to have a sense of irony?
I mean, I think typically the answer to questions around will the AI do what is like human, or like just the anthropocentric questions towards AI are, um, I think, for me the answer there is like no, like they're not ironic, they're tools. But the irony in the work came up definitely in part thinking about one of the ways we got to where we did with the project was I kept trying to understand sort of fundamentally, how do these things work? What is it? What is the ground floor? What is the simplest, what are the fewest steps you could use to produce, to leverage like a artificial neural network, like to get something to work, but in its simplest form? And at the level of the pixels, if it's like what number of pixels are required to complete a neural network. And so the irony there is that it's completely not how they work. Like it's the antithesis of what their functions, what they're good at. They want to work with large data sets and huge amounts of information. So I think in the pursuit of the project, I was always trying to push in the most simplistic form, and in doing so, we actually end up in these kind of ironic spaces, which for me was actually very valuable in learning what they do and what they don't do. So that was a productive kind of pursuit.
But you also stopped your process of squaring the circle once you had sort of a basic idea of what it was, right? As if, okay, it's kind of an ironic concept in the first place to give to a computer. And so it's built into a lot of the work you do, which I found really interesting, but also can't help but think, where are we going in terms of the artificial intelligence side of this, if that's even conceivable? It maybe brings me to a question for you guys, which is this notion of the avant-garde, which no one brought up specifically, but in some ways, a lot of what we're working with, all of you, comes out of the tradition of the artistic avant-garde in different kinds of ways. And there is, of course, the surrealist Dada tradition, word salads, the idea of William Burroughs, kind of concepts of producing a text seems to relate to some of the things you're doing, but also Fred Jameson's idea of the surrealism without the unconscious, right, which was his way of shorthanding postmodernism, another term we don't really use too much anymore. So I guess I'm posing that to you in relationship to the work you're doing. How much of this is still embedded in some concepts of culture coming out of this kind of historic avant-garde, the references to French salon, it's all there. And how does that sort of maybe inform the work, or even maybe shape the work, much in the way Daniel pointed out, the system that produces the slit theory, slit experiment actually has a role besides the observer in collapsing the field.
You can start.
Maybe, yeah, thank you for the question. It's not as this seem to be working with people on yeah, okay. Yeah, well, I was immediately brought to mind of you referred to the study we did a while back, and one of the things we did was in creating this study of basically the point of the study was, what do poets want? What would poets want if they could have a kind of poetry algorithmic, an algorithmic assistant for their own poetic practice? And we found people who were from very different sorts of poetic traditions, and some people who were coming from a kind of, a certain kind of formalist tradition, as you would expect, asked for systems that would assist them in a kind of poetics that you might consider conservative by some standard, if we're using the vocabulary of the avant-garde. Yeah, traditional, let's say. Yeah, thank you. That's a better way of putting it. And I'll just say, something I think a lot about is sort of like a baseline is actually, traditional poetic forms like the sonnet. The sonnet is if you look at it, I was trying to make the point that something that isn't inherently on its own very interesting, can be interesting to think with. If you just looked at the printed instructions of a sonnet, it would, if you can erase all of what you know about the sonnet, it's not that interesting as a text. You could imagine adding more stanzas, a different rhyme scheme. You don't lose much either way. So I think that maybe one way of, I think that yes, there maybe is some threads of connection to it avant-garde, but maybe also in the opposite direction too, of thinking about more traditional poetic practices that take form seriously as a mediator for thought. The kind of hunch behind the writing a sonnet is that the sonnet's good for you. It's going to do something for your mind that is that you will be glad to have done to it. So I think that that sort of traditionalist intuition can also be seen in a kind of attempt to create maybe some systems that seem weirder, but they're also fulfilling this, maybe more traditional role.
Yeah. Ooh. Yeah, sure. This is kind of on. I'll speak loudly. So I think, yeah, certainly like the tradition of avant-garde and like definitely surrealism. Like when I write papers, I feel like I'm often like giving everyone this like 2 sentence summary of like people have thought about this already quite a bit. Because I think sometimes you see these things turn up in computer science as if they were the first ones to like think of rearranging words in a sentence, or that you might like pull words out of a hat. And so I certainly think that's like going on and part of it. And I think you see like people being more or less aware of these ideas, but it is interesting to think that they're kind of maybe being reinvented all the time. Um, I mean, I'd also say to Kyle's point, something that I'm interested in is like the sonnet, like what makes someone return to a tool that someone else has invented. Um, Forms are invented all the time, and some of them stick around and some of them don't. And people are creating tools for themselves, all the time. And I'm interested in what makes someone interested in adopting someone else's tool. Like what makes you want to go back and repeat a Dadaist experiment versus coming up with your own in that tradition, versus maybe like seeing what your friend did and saying, that was really interesting. I'm going to do that exact same thing, but maybe in a slightly different way or better. And so maybe less so than being interested in like the precise lineage. I'm interested in what makes you like want to adopt something that someone has already done.
Thank you. Questions from the proponents? No, I'll throw another one out. Yeah, go ahead. I think we have microphones.
Yeah. Come to the mic because there is a live stream. There are mics on both sides.
I've actually, it's not really a question, but more of a kind of following up on the statement which you just made, because for at least the last couple of years, I've been waiting for the conversation around generative AI, mainly around image generation, but also textual generation, to be kind of framed within that exact discourse. And I haven't heard anybody talking about it. And I think that if you could take those two themes, like I was trained as an artist, in the 80s and 90s, where the two predominant themes were postmodernism or whatever came just after postmodernism, or whatever the 90s version of postmodernism was, kind of postmodernism mixed with cyberpunk or whatever. And this thread of de-skillification, which is run through the entirety of like 20th century art. From you noted the Dadaists, the Surrealists, John Cage, William Burroughs, all the way up to more recent practitioners like oh shoot, I was going to say Seth Price, but it's not the artist. Is it the artist? The one that does the big Epson prints, of like the X's and, huh? Wade Guyton, thank you. I always get those two like conflated for some reason. And so I think that it would be very interesting. It would maybe help clear up a lot of the misunderstandings or some of the hysteria about generative AI if you know, those kind of discourses could be like front and center. But I haven't heard the word postmodernism. I haven't heard anybody say the word postmodernism in literally years. And postmodernism.
As many times as possible, ideally.
But also, but while you, but while you were discussing your work, my, all these thoughts rattling around in my head was, you know, AI is this kind of constantly self-perfecting system. You know, these computer scientists and these corporate engineers and, everybody's trying to perfect the system of what AI can do in terms of its utility and functionality. Whereas I think as artists, we were a lot more interested in the kind of Wild West version of it when it was ugly and glitchy and stupid. And as it continues to self-perfect and it moves away from this kind of simulation of this 20th century avant-garde position into something that resembles more like, I don't know, like corporate copywriting or stock footage, like how do you, I'm interested, I'm just a user of it, but you guys are seem kind of more engaged in, developing things from the ground up. So I'm wondering, like, what's your idea of of how the system can kind of perfect itself to get what you want out of it? Or are you happy kind of having it continue to be marginal, continue to be experimental, or at least resemble those experimental forms which we're talking about?
Could I put a little spin on it and talk Peter Watt's idea of artificial stupidity?
Oh, man,
Right.
that's been my tagline
So
for
is that-
years. Yeah.
Is that something maybe more desirable as a sort of end game?
I just want to challenge this phrase of like self-perfecting themselves because I feel like that's not quite accurate. There's like the current way in which most large language, like the corporate large language models are trained is they're actually given pretty clear objectives, and there's this like human feedback reinforcement learning, which is like pushing these machines to be like particularly like subservient and please and thank you and oh, I can't do that for you, but I can do something else. Like those things are very much designed elements, and I think something that you realize very quickly in the computer science world is like even this idea of optimization is very complicated, right? Because there is a question of what you're optimizing for. So I just want to be careful of language that somehow takes out the viewpoint that like a person at some point decided these models should be this way. This isn't, for instance, some kind of like natural state that if we just let the models go, this is what they turn into. Absolutely not. Like they are designed to be this way for very particular reasons.
But it is sold that way a little bit to us, right?
Sold what way?
That it is a self-perfecting system, and that as the more we use it, it's going to become more and more dominant, and it's going to take over.
Right, but that's a myth, right? Or like that's propaganda that I think we should avoid repeating.
But that narrative also runs through the concept of the avant-garde, from the very beginning. Saint-Simon, and way back, early 19th century, talked about the idea of sort of, the artist needs to join with the engineer to produce this kind of future society. And so I wonder,
Well, you wonder what?
I wonder if we don't actually operate with some of those tropes unconsciously, even when we're using maybe sort of surrealism or Dadaism to disrupt the system, we're actually participating in this notion of a teleology of a sort of end game.
I am like almost certainly not the right person to answer this question. But I will say that I think to me, again, I feel like almost embarrassed in front of this room of like maybe quote unquote real artists. But like surely the experience of being an artist is one of like developing your own taste and like developing your own internal sense of what you're going for, which is like inherently not what other people have been going for. And I think pushes against the idea that we are all kind of are eking towards some like perfect artistic expression and rather like diverging all the time.
And if I could just add, this kind of connects to your idea of like a model that you could not just use begrudgingly, but actually feel like you kind of are invested in it and you love it. I've been thinking about the ways that does anyone have like nostalgia or like for GPT-2 because it's like has these flaws. Maybe some people do, but are people actually like, no, I only use GPT-2. I'm not using anything else. Like I only write with fountain pens. I only type with, mechanical, typewriter, and I only use GPT-2 because it has these qualities that I have come to love. And insofar as they can be understood, I understand them. We have this kind of simpatico. Like I wonder if people anywhere, I certainly don't have that kind of relationship to language models. I wonder if there are people who are cultivating those sorts of relationships that are not just, oh, whatever the new one is that has, there's one released every week and there are scoreboards of this is the new one that did well on this, on like the LSAT. So now everyone's going to use that model this week until the next one comes out. I wonder if people in their day-to-day lives are kind of resisting that by choosing the worst ones because it's their friend or something.
It's a great point.
Yeah, okay.
Did you want, Daniel?
Yeah, I think it's important just to sort of chime in around a lot of the time in these conversations at like these around our AI discourse, we treat AI like a monolith. And I think that's kind of problematic. It's not. There's like a million different systems that do a million different things, and there are a million different tools. So artists are going to find all kinds of creative pathways to mix and remix and adapt and mutate and foster completely unexpected use cases for the tools. And I think that's the one of the creative opportunities that these systems have. And it's also, I think we kind of dumb ourselves down a bit when we start to think sort of about it as a single monolithic entity.
Yeah, just to when I was talking about like my own book of poetry and this idea of like reordering the poem. So for that book, it's like very related to a very classic computer science problem called the traveling salesman problem, which is actually like very, very computationally difficult to solve and is like considered one of the open questions in computer science is like how you can solve this optimally in a reasonable period of time. And so one of the things that I liked about that project and the fact that it kind of took me into this area of computer science is like it is a very foundational and important aspect of computer science that is like arguably much more difficult than everything we're seeing with language models because it's like literally an unsolved problem. We don't call it AI for like mostly like cultural and historical reasons. But I was kind of tickled by the fact that I'd stumbled on something arguably much more difficult than any of the stuff we're seeing being done at like OpenAI or like you said, in this kind of monolithic notion of what technology is right now.
Sir, you have a question?
So I wanted to ask a ensemble park related question. Actually, they're both two questions, probably both related to that of Kyle and Katie. The first about a topic I took up, which is my understanding is that ensemble park is about human computer collaboration. And so how do you decide where you draw the line editorially about what works are human computer collaborations and what works are maybe too standalone as computer programs? And then the other question, which I didn't speak to, is why do things in print? Actually, and you may think this is a funny question coming from me, but I'm asking the questions here. I want to know what your responses to this are. I do a lot of computer generated writing in print myself, but I'm interested to know what your engagements with print and computer generated texts are.
It was definitely like an editorial decision about like some of the things that were submitted. We actually asked people to like give us more information about the project because it was hard for us to determine whether or not we thought it like met our bar, like it was like adequate collaboration. I don't know if you want to say more about it.
Yeah, so I think that so I don't think there's like a great philosophical distinction to be made between like work that just generates output versus like loops of humans and computers interacting. Because in the case of, one of your code works, Nick, you're writing words and then you're interacting with the computer in a different way. So I don't think we want to make any like really hard and fast distinction there. But I think that one of the things that we're interested, exactly because computer generation itself has become this sort of ossified term that implies output that we want to, and there are spaces that where that's exactly what's literary venues that explore that. We are interested in this entanglement, and I think Katie's expertise in human computer interaction is a big influence there. And just, from, going back to maybe my interest in proletarianization, I think that for me, the interesting moment is when you are kind of, okay, so there's a temporal quality. When in traditional like computer generation, like human does something, output comes out, that's it. There's a certain power granted to the person who gets to do the entity that gets to do something first. They're kind of the boss. So when then the computer gets to boss you around somehow, that's a different power relation, and that's a different kind of mediation of thought that can happen in that sense. And I know that I'm not. I saw the table of contents. I know that there's that sort of work in output too, and certainly in your other editorial ventures as well. So yeah, I don't think of it as like a, this or that. I think of it as, emphasizing what happens when you're kind of maybe under the thumb of the algorithm sometimes, having to deal with what it's telling you to do, and then maybe switching back around, and then you get to tell it to do something again, and then back and forth. So how complex can we make those back and forth processes? That seems to me, I think that seems to us underexplored in just like the general computer literature space, and that's what we're trying to explore.
And then as for why print, probably mostly because I really like print, which is probably the reason most people do things in print is they just really like books. But I think also to Kyle's point, it did seem like in the kind of computer mediated world, there wasn't a ton of print, and like also making it print like means there's certain affordances you don't have in terms of like computer interaction. And so I think it kind of spoke to our aesthetic interest of the computer interacting with the writing process, but not necessarily it being like computer writing where things could be, for instance, moving.
Can I say one more very special, nuance, like particular thing about this issue actually is it contains, so Ensemble Park exists online. The print issue, you might see a little plus. That's because there are these extra interviews with the authors. And we thought, print is like it's like a coterie object. Like there aren't that many copies. If you grab one, you're one of the only people who can read those. So we also were just interested in creating a space where people might want to talk freely about their process in a way that might be a little bit uncomfortable to do when it's online, and it's not permanent, less permanent than this probably, but it has a kind of feeling of permanent exposure that I personally find really uncomfortable. I don't have any information about myself on like my university departmental website. They write me every week saying, will you give us a headshot? I can't do it. So I'm, as someone who kind of, retreats from that kind of exposure, I like the idea of print as being like a cozy little place you're hanging out with your friends.
I think
New
we're,
friends,
we're
yeah.
gearing up for the coffee break, but maybe we have one more question from someone, maybe someone online who didn't get a chance to speak. Otherwise, we'll wrap it.
I think that because we've been having all these tech issues, we're going to skip the online questions.
Got it. Okay,
But
anybody
then
online, I'm
has a
sorry.
question in the audience, and they just brought coffee and cookies, so we can do both.
Can I just ask one other question that maybe for the future? Do you think we're eventually going to need some new form of the Turing test to tell what's being produced from this new merger? Katie?
There's just like a huge world of research around like watermarking and trying to detect or otherwise mark computer generated content. And I think when you dig into that research, you realize, as with many things, this problem is like largely like much more a socio-cultural problem than like necessarily a technical one. And as we were talking about, like photo manipulation has like this super long history and like all these issues with like detecting manipulated content. I don't think any of those have like particularly changed. I went to like an economics conference recently about AI, which was very interesting. And they had this idea of like the equilibrium point. So they were like, people are really worried about deepfakes might make like certain kinds of authentication with like banking, for instance, no longer possible. And like some people think that's going to like lead to a breakdown in banking. And they're like, no, those people don't know what they're talking about. We'll just like come up with different forms of authentication that do work for banks, and we'll just like stop relying on these ones that are no longer so reliable. So this is all to say, if you want to keep talking about this, I happen to know a lot about this area. It's very interesting, but I don't think Turing tests are going to be the basis.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Daniel, Katie, Kyle, thank you very much, everyone.